really a pleasure to be here. This was my home for 15 years. I left 2 years ago. I was living in Cambridge, and so now it's, extra nice to be back. Obviously, for us Palestinians, to be talking about racism at this time is a harrowing task. I hope I'll be staying within my 15 minutes. Obviously, tell me when I'm over over my time. What I want to talk to you about today is what a process within the kind of racialized and dehumanizing discourse that has been accompanying the genocidal violence on Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank in the last nearly 2 years. And it's a process that, I've been trying for a long time. We've been, since 1948, witnessing and experiencing annihilation and the process of elimination and incremental genocide that has acquired an unprecedented magnitude in the last nearly 2 years. One of the things that I think keeps us human is to keep trying to think about what are the epistemic and affective structures that support this kind of the normalization of this violence. And there is a process that I tried elsewhere to call a reversal of reality. So those of us who live and work in the West have spent careers writing about life, death, resistance, love, and pain, addressing desensitized audiences who have learned to see Palestinians as violent, backward, and less than human. Settler colonial power has long proceeded by dehumanizing and absenting the colonized from its gaze. But while such multifaceted epistemic violence against Palestinians was once primarily the modality of Israel, today qualitatively novel structures of dehumanization are being deployed, affecting a wider, deeper, and more systematic inversion of reality through innocuous-sounding rubrics such as impartiality, scientific standards, and in some strands of, especially anthropological writings, ethics. These prisms are increasingly applied across contexts. There is a continuum from universities to government representatives, media outlets, and certain strands, as I said, of academic writing. I believe there is really an urgent need to name and to challenge what paradoxically amounts to techniques of reality reversal, and to understand not just their geopolitical aims, but primarily the epistemic and affective structures that underpin them. So let me take you to, the present day. Scene 1. This is the scene of the ever unfinished picture of death and devastation that Israel has inflicted onto Gaza in the past 17 months or 20 months now. Thousands of Palestinians, in a recent report published by Harvard University, the number has amounted to nearly 400,000 people have disappeared. And recently, the Israeli representatives have confirmed this number by arguing that the number of the population in Gaza has decreased from 2,200,000 people to 1,800,000. So with hundreds of thousands of people disappeared and more, buried under the rubble still, 40,000 children orphaned, 1,238 intergenerational families, meaning entire bloodlines across generations wiped out, nearly 4,000 families with only one surviving member. These are the harrowing pictures. The Israeli onslaught has wounded and maimed hundreds of thousands of bodies in addition. Over 232 journalists have been killed. A Brown study has found that the war on Gaza has, since October 7th, killed more journalists than the US Civil War, World War I and II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Yugoslavia wars, and the war in Afghanistan post 9/11, and has named Gaza one of the largest news graveyards. The 12 universities have been either totally destroyed or damaged by Israeli bombs. And already by June 2024, more than 80% of Gaza's schools had been destroyed. On top of this, Israel has committed ecocide, destroying 70% of agricultural land, and domicide, reducing 87% of housing units and infrastructures to rubble. These statistics are only partially able to account for, let alone convey, a devastation that is incalculable and which will continue to produce injuries, both physical and psychic, and deaths for years to come. Yet, in an inverted mode of seeing the world, Israel, and now academic institutions, politicians, governments, managed to transpose the violence enacted against Palestinian bodies to Palestinians, representing them as the perpetrators of violence, as carriers of bias, and as a threat. This reversal now extends to civil society groups, academics, students, ordinary citizens who are mobilizing against Israel's systematic and systemic violation of international law. Now, what I argue is that we are witnessing a novel epistemic framing where increasingly facts are trumped by emotions. Consider, for example, how Israel justifies the indiscriminate bombings of Palestinian people with claims that Hamas uses civilians as human shields and hospitals and schools as military infrastructure. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock parroted the human shield claim a year ago in front of the German Bundestag, for instance, providing this kind of justification for the Israeli genocidal onslaught. And I quote, "That's why we have made it clear time and again that self-defense means, of course, not only attacking terrorists, but destroying them. That's why I have made it so clear that when Hamas terrorists hide behind people, behind schools, then we end up in very difficult waters. But we are not shying away from this. This is what I made clear at the United Nations, that civilian sites could lose their protected status if terrorists abuse this status." End of quote. For this claim to have any validity or weight, Israel would need to prove that Hamas deliberately trapped civilians in zones of wars. But all evidence they have provided has been quashed, revealed to be fabricated. In fact, Israel bombs civilians and fighters alike, wherever they are. It has left no escape route that is safe, no non-hostile zone. Palestinians, in fact, have provided ample evidence that it is the Israeli army that uses their bodies as human shields in their military operations. So much so that even the CNN, the New York Times, and the Guardian have had to admit that this is Israel's routine practice. But despite the relentless outpouring of data, facts, and above all the availability of real-time televised evidence of Israeli soldiers killing, burning alive, and shooting at gunpoint Palestinian children, women, and men, as well as the unjustified destruction of hospitals, churches, mosques, universities, schools, homes, many still endorse the idea that the wholesale annihilation of Palestinian life is a right of self-defense. I call this phenomenon inverted reality. Scene 2. At a meeting of the European Association of Social Anthropology, EASA, in August 2024, members discussed the recently created working group on academic freedom. From its inception, this working group, of which I'm a nominated member, found itself primarily addressing requests to support colleagues and vulnerable staff facing threats and intimidation for their positions against the genocide on Palestine. But some eminent members of the associations, apparently intent on blocking its efforts, described the working group as the Spanish, or akin to the Spanish Inquisition, no less. Some of the audience found the comparison quite laughable, and obviously here too. But others felt deeply unsettled. How could a group tasked with assisting colleagues and students facing serious violations of their academic freedom be portrayed as themselves the repressing measure? What kinds of perversions allow for this reversal of reality? I do not mean to make the obvious point that Israeli violence is backed by a propaganda machine or geopolitical interests. Nor I wish to illustrate the various ways Germany, in pole position, in which European countries are variously attempting to redeem themselves from their Nazi and racist legacies or to protract their colonial and imperial ones. I wish merely to note that in the reversal of reality that is at work, the unconditional support for Israel relies on a decontextualization, as expressed clearly by the German foreign minister, quote, "It was a day on which the terrorists dragged the region closer to the abyss," and on an emotive and affective economy in which, erasing the historical and political context of Palestine allows for this arbitrary ascribing of a right to Israel of defense and a redistribution of vulnerability and the reversal of victim and offender, inciting feelings of sorrow and protection for the victims that in this case are, the Israelis, but not the Palestinians. Let me just, since I don't have time, jump to my concluding remarks, where I try to kind of make sense of this pattern of constantly reversing reality through an emotive, affective language that appears as, objective, impartial, and so on. So what is the epistemological framework in which this, diverse example of reversal of reality flourish? Perhaps it is not enough, as we do, to continue to insist on the very facts of the incommensurable scale of death and suffering inflicted onto Palestinians to readdress these perceptual prisms at work. We need to attend to historical ways of killing and dying to appreciate and understand who the human in liberal discourses of the good and better societies and impartiality is, and to see how and why what appears to some as a dystopic reversal of reality is perfectly reconciled as facts and reasons in the mind of others. To this aim, let us turn to German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock's speech on October 10th, 2024, which I mentioned at the outset, during the debate at the German Bundestag on the first anniversary of the October 7th attack. In reference to testimonies of October 7th survivors, of course, Israelis, the minister stated, and I quote, "We've heard a few stories, too few, I think, here this morning, stories that are beyond our power of comprehension. But it is so important that we keep telling those stories about lives that could be our own. To comprehend why Israeli lives can be our own, but Palestinians' lives cannot, we turn to Talal al-Assad's analysis of the ethics and violence and law. Talal al-Assad has suggested that humanity is a metaphysical notion, as opposed to humans as embodied living subjects. It is the pain and suffering of individual bodies rather than of humanity that triggers empathy in others and the need to act. Although law claims universality and the sacrality of all human lives, modern Western colonial sensibilities consider some ways of inflicting death to be more inhumane than others. It is a Christian ethics about what constitutes humane behavior that defined, through colonial and imperial wars, the grievable life, the human life whose loss incites compassion and action. The civilized have codified ways of killing which do not apply to those deemed uncivilized. As Talal al-Assad puts it, barbarians and savages do not have the notion of collateral damage, which explicitly allows the civilized actually to kill non-combatants in military action, because only the civilized have conceptions of legal responsibility in warfare. When those who inflict pain, suffering, and death are deemed to be the uncivilized, because they operate outside of a modern state and its rules of warfare, they ignite the Euro-American ethico-legal sensibility. Baerbock's lives, Israeli lives, can be German lives. The civilized then deem the killing horrific and requiring immediate and unconditional intervention. The death of an incommensurable number of Palestinian civilians is not therefore acknowledged as barbaric slaughter, but as self-defense. The only question on the table then is one of proportionality. Seen from this frame, the reversal of reality might appear not so much as illogic, but as the dehumanizing logic of a Euro-American ethical legal sensibility, naming which lives are human and which deaths are hence grievable. Thank you.